this. Don't need to. I don't need to see my thought. Okay, so we've waited the requisite 10 minutes for visitors. So, and Adrian, where's Adrian? He's more responsible. So, just like housekeeping, most of the activities are happening here today, except the atrium, which I've decided to move to the other room because it has better conferencing, video conferencing stuff, technologies, in case other people want to join us from the Relay Society for the Assembly General Meeting. And Rob will be joining us online as well. So, those of you who have recently become members, I know that Vito has. So, those of you who recently become members, you are welcome to attend the Assembly General Meeting. It will be held at lunchtime at 1 p.m. But in the program, it says it's in this room, but instead it's where we got the badges from. So, the other room that has better video conferencing technology. There shouldn't be too many of us. It's a smaller room, but there shouldn't be too many of us. So I'm sure we can all fit in there. Okay. So, welcome. Good morning, and welcome to this second day of the Yates Conference, Conjuring Yates. I am very happy to be starting this day with the roundtable. One of I'm excited about so many things. I was super excited about this today, that was something we planned. I was super excited about Matt organizing the roundtable like we did with Tom and Peter. But I'm also very excited. Oh, sorry, I was right in front of you. Sorry. I'm also very excited to be introducing this roundtable with Ragini and with Barry. This is my attempt to bring together aspects that have to do with transnationalism but also translation. We have lots of students from the translation program, and it is a desire that I have to bring more lit translation into the mix. So this was something that I was very excited to do. We talked yesterday, last night, during the reception about the dynamics. We went through a little bit about the dynamics, and something that Barry and Rajni told me that could work was that instead of having a chair, they could do their own thing, and I think that makes it more dialogic. So I agreed, and I let Larissa off the hook from chairing the session. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to you straight away. I don't know who's starting. Ragini is. Okay.
Just leave it in the middle.
Yeah, that should be.
By starting, I mean that I'm introducing Barry, who's going to speak first. All right, so our first speaker today is Barry Shields. He's professor in the Department of English at Durham University. He is the author of W.B. Yeats and World Literature, the Subject of Poetry, and of course several other works besides. I think most pertinently to our theme today, the Roundtable's theme is comparative, transnational, and translational perspectives. Barry works on Irish modernism, transnationalism, ecologies, psychoanalysis, and world literature. And his paper is titled Translation and Belief in Yeats's Later Works.
Thanks, Ragini. Is this working?
It is. I'm just going to bring it slightly closer to
Yeah,
you.
okay.
Yeah.
Is that better?
So, is it better?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you for the introduction. In speaking, we spoke a little bit yesterday of genre and the kind of oddity of Yeats's genres. And I think it's something that both Ragini and myself are going to talk about today, how translation and genre might be questions which converge. And it's also worth thinking about the genre of the round table. I'm always concerned when people say round table. They often end up being panels, which may be one of the reasons why we decided to forego a chair. So maybe we'll try to be quite brief in our comments, and then leave time for conversation. And also, my comments are directed, I suppose, more outward rather than, this is not a paper that I've written. It's something that I've comprised in accordance with what was said yesterday, actually. Okay, it's commonplace within literary studies today to focus on how particular genres move around the world. There's even, we might say, an increasing investment in genre as a standardizing unit of commerce within transnational and world literary studies in its current configuration. Precisely so that we can think about how, for example, the European novel was adapted by South American writers, or how the Japanese haiku was reacculturated by European modernists, or more recently in Brazil, as I've learned from Giselle, how Brazilian poets reimagine the haiku as a three-line poem, right? So this transcultural work is still ongoing. My contention today is that this critical tradition, that of trying to map the distribution of genres across the world, has been much less concerned with writing practices. And specifically, it has underplayed the extent to which the scale of literary exchange across languages comes to determine the literary work as multi-generic, or as moving between genre. We thought yesterday a bit about the odd coding of some of Yeats's work genre-wise, and I'm going to try to say a bit more about this in relation to his 1935 volume, The King of the Great Clock Tower. I suppose initially, though, I want to insist that it is never redundant nor even secondary when considering the traditions of literature into which Yeats was entered, to consider also the translational economies that constituted those traditions. And here I had thought, given the conference theme, I would at least mention biblical hermeneutics as a model for close reading, whose revelations or visions disavow the labor of translation. This is encoded in certain ideas of the apostolic and the evangelical. Yesterday, we thought about texts such as the Blake edition and Williams' wonderful paper, whose incorporation of commentaries and improvements made for a strange artifact, we said. Yet scriptural and translational projects would seem to be the most exact antecedents for that kind of work. I want to argue more generally that Yeats's implication in translation projects was one important reason for the cross-generic nature of a lot of his writing. Though Yeats's work is not strictly speaking work in translation, it is certainly in the 1930s, through his collaborations with the Swami Sri Purohit, work based on the work of translation, and conspicuously so. And the work of translation always, I argue, includes a redistribution of genre codes. So poetry is not lost in translation. Rather, in translation, its negotiation with, for example, theatrical speech or the prosaic is fundamentally altered. And we can see this in Yeats's work from very early in his career, as in those folkloric works which slyly mimicked the form of revival translations from the Irish, including, say, Douglas Hyde's Love Songs of Connacht. You can see here just a page from Hyde's text. It wasn't the only revival translation to do this, but you can see that as well as the original Irish language version, you have a verse translation in English, and then below the bar, you have an English prose translation, or a literal translation. So the truth of the original in Irish, the true verse, the true form, is here redistributed across poetry and prose in English. We see Yeats thinking about this too when he introduces Tagore's Gitanjali. It's a prose translation of original songs whose metrical sophistications, Yeats tells us in his famous preface, are lost to all but Bengali readers. And we see it in the 1930s, when Yeats puts into a common English with the Swami Sri Purohit, the Upanishads. This is a geopolitically displaced and reoriented Wordsworthian project which weds the lyrical to the balladic, but which crucially also depends on the prior publication and editing of Sri Purohit's memoir of his life and education, as well as Sri Purohit's translation of Sri Hamsa's memoir of his pilgrimage to the holy mountain of Meru. As Yeats convened this project, and here are some of the publications that he co-authored or introduced with Sri Purohit, As he convened this project, collaborating also, of course, with T.S. Eliot through Faber, he put a lot of emphasis on the ordering of genre, such that we can see in his letter to Sturge Moore that the Swami should give first objective narrative, and only when that is complete, his doctrine. For Europe has ideas and believes none of them because we lack spiritual experience. He has that. He has spiritual experience. The intensity of a religious truth, its rules, its forms of prayer, incantation, its conjuring, in one language, Sanskrit, depends here for its global vitality on an extended prosaic account in English of one monk's existence. Arguably, Yeats translates within English too, as when he adapts Walter Pater's prose portrait of the Mona Lisa in his Oxford Book of Modern Verse. This was mentioned yesterday, which is why I bring it up. Here too, we can say the impetus comes from other languages, however. Not only Whitman's new American idiom, but the French experiments in free verse, and again, the Orientalist vogue for an Eastern structure underlying Europe's world order. She has been trafficked for strange webs with Eastern merchants. Hannah Sullivan has argued that this is not free verse, so that the Mona Lisa, as Yeats redistributes the prose into poetry, is not actually free verse, but rather remains chopped up prose. It's not verse, it's prose. Most basically, this is because the line breaks are not used to create the unexpected in sense or sound. Rather, they echo the underlying syntactic structure of the sentence. The breaks here don't challenge the logic of the sentence with a logic of their own, in other words. So for Sullivan, this fails as free verse, which is, she says, precisely Yeats's intention, because he wants to draw a line between prose and poetry. I would argue differently. It seems to me that Yeats is less concerned to draw a fast distinction between metrical verse and prose than to draw attention to their inevitable confusion. That indeed the life of one might depend on the reputation of the other. And it's my main contention that the practice of translation, also thinking of translation as constitutive of the literary field, helps us to see how accomplishments within one genre or tradition of writing are always animated at a distance and in relation to other genres. So what do I mean to say that the life of one genre, say metrical verse in English, depends on the reputation of another, say discursive prose? This letter where Yeats is giving practical advice to the prolific Irish author Monk Gibbon might help elucidate the point. In my experience, literature is a lifelong war against a sedentary element in speech. You are too difficult, and this is a sedentary element. When I write, I again and again say to myself, I am living somewhere in the Himalayas, talking to pilgrims, or I'm in Iceland 1,000 years ago. But I am also myself talking to, not writing for, certain young Mayo lads who are going to fish and have little learning, which means that I must be timeless, yet find modern symbols. If I were an Englishman, I might substitute Birmingham workmen for Mayo lads, or I might not. I love that I might not. Yeah. In a sense, this is a familiar enough idea, one Yeats repeated in various ways throughout his career, that modern literature should be powered by ancient and folkloric traditions, that living speech should be privileged over the abstractions of written language, that the poet should aim for the simple and enduring over the difficult and the newfangled. In another sense, however, it describes a patently difficult way of excising difficulty from one's poetry. Since the scenes Yeats imagines here, intended to conjure directness and simplicity, seem to require speech in languages other than English. It is not just that his living, non-sedentary speech is potentially ancient in this passage, it's 1,000 years ago in Iceland, and therefore reliably dead, but it is also that to imagine the source of a modern English language poetry, he uses 3 non-English settings, the Himalayas, Iceland, Mayo, whose native languages are not necessarily understood, whose utterances, therefore, are ambient rather than specifically formed or communicated. It's true that the Mayo lads may, in the 1930s, be speaking English rather than Irish, yet his hesitation around the inclusion of Birmingham workmen suggests that the very worst inhibition to an authentic poetic practice, which relies on the upstanding vitality of living speech, is that the poet might understand the meaning of the words being spoken. Accompanying this implication of multiple languages operating within the accomplishment of one language, we should note that the place of simplicity in Yeats's valorization of poetry suggests theatricality, as well as the straightforwardness of prose. He encapsulated a similar thought in a very well-known passage, one that I return to again and again, I can't leave it alone, from autobiographies concerning the modernization of his style. And here I think style is the key word. In prose, we use the term style to suggest where prose becomes most poetic, right? But in poetry, why do we use the term style? Because everything that's most poetic about poetry is understood as form. So then style is what is prosaic in poetry. And this is exactly what Yeats says. Through much knowledge of the stage, through the exfoliation of my own style, I learned that occasional prosaic words give the impression of an active man speaking. Here and there, in correcting my early poems, I've introduced numbness and dullness, turned, for instance, the curd pale moon into the brilliant moon, that all might seem, as it were, remembered with indifference, except some one vivid image. The specific reference is to, as we all know, is to his revisions to the Sorrow of Love, a poem from 1892, which he revised several times through to 1925 by making it more prosaic. This is a familiar version of modernism wringing the neck of rhetoric and excising Victorian eloquence from modernist prosody. Crucially, however, in order to accomplish a modern style, Yeats has to allow prose into the poem. His is a deliberate vulgarization of form, prose working through and against the form in order to make it alive. The intimacy of prosaic words of an active man speaking is an admission of the value of the vulgarization of language. The same kind of banalization or vulgarization we often attribute to translations. Translations vulgarize the original. See the literal English below the line in the original, in Hyde's Love Songs of Connaught, or see Yeats's own comments on the missing Bengali prosody in Gitanjali. Yet somehow, it is through this same vulgarization or banality that emerges a living simplicity. Right? So there's a kind of paradox in Yeats's approach to languages and language. Prose and paraphrase is everywhere in and around Yeats's poetic forms, especially in the 1930s. It's in his various prefaces, which are apologias for his work. Yesterday, someone mentioned Swift on prefaces. And Yeats is Swiftian in this regard. It's in his intermittent commentaries, and it's also in his method. For example, Yeats said of At Parnell's funeral, which is included in the collection, The King of the Great Clock Tower, that he was simply putting into rhyme a lecture he had delivered in America, so chopped up prose. Well, many of his poems of the same period, including Meru, were summarized in prose before being turned into poetry. So you can see here this Meru, the poem, but the first example, he calls it theme for a poem or theme for poetry. And he also says summing up somewhere when he talks about Meru. If you go back one, is that okay? Just so you can see the quotation from Yeats around this. Several of the supernatural songs included in the same volume were written while Yeats was most engaged with the Hinduism of Sri Purohit, were recorded as prose sketches before they were turned into songs. They were rough translations, we might say, before they were poems. You can see this letter. I think that if you go two down, another. Yeah, so here he's talking about the construction of supernatural songs. He's sort of coming up with themes. He's writing out sketches, prose sketches, and then he's working them up into verse. So we can see how translation and paraphrase become part of the process of creating original poetry in English for Yeats. English prose can hold the intricacy of poetic form in another language, whilst English poetic forms require the vulgarization of prose to make them vital. The title for my paper, which I slightly revised, is Nobody Language. Nobody Language, that phrase comes from the Rapallo notebooks. It's from his account of giving Ezra Pound a draft of his play, The King of the Great Clock Tower, in June 1934. Pound condemned the play as nobody language. At first, I took his condemnation as a confirmation of my fear that I am not too old. I have hardly written little verse for 3 years. But nobody language is something I can remedy. I must write in verse, but first in prose to set structure. The 1935 published volume of The King of the Great Clock Tower is generically complex. It combines prose preface, the play, fragments of verse, and extensive prose commentary, including a version of Parnell's funeral called A Parnellite at Parnell's Funeral, which has a prose commentary between parts 1 and 2. In other words, Yeats interrupts A Parnell's Funeral to interpret it before then returning to finish the poem. So it's not a commentary below the line like the literal translation in Hyde's Love Songs and Sonnet. The prose shares prestige with verse, the same prestige as the verse. It occupies the same space on the page, the same area in the text. The volume also includes supernatural songs, which obviously were influenced by Sri Purohit. In the preface to the volume, Yeats admits that Pound, after too long spent eulogizing Mussolini and calling Dublin a reactionary hole, which is our theme for next year, I think, he arrived at a single word evaluation for Yeats's play, putrid. That Yeats didn't quite lose heart was due to the resilience of prose. He used prose to set the structure of his play, he tells us. And indeed, the play is largely made up of prose dialogues between the king, the queen, and this mysterious Green Knight figure called Stroller. Just to return, so you can see there, I wrote the prose dialogues. There's also of the king of the Great Clock Tower that I might be forced to make lyrics for its imaginary people. Just staying with these prose speeches for a minute, it's worth noting that their words are echoed by songs sung by the attendants. The attendants sing, for example, this is just one of the, I don't know if you can read that, but the attendants will sing the queen's words for her, for example, or they'll sing the words of the head of the stroller once the head has been, once the stroller has been beheaded. These songs don't exist to further the action of the play, rather they iterate what has already been done. In some sense, they re-genreify it. There's been this prose dialogue and then action, and then the songs kind of reiterate. As Yeats puts it in the commentary, I say to the musicians, lose my words in patterns of sound, as the name of God is lost in Arabian arabesques. They are a secret between the singers, myself, yourself. The plain fable, the plain prose of the dialogue, Ninette de Valois' dance are there for the audience. So the prose that at first supported his work before it had found its proper form as verse now seems demeaned as merely popular. A hieratic art of playing and singing music and of writing poetry on the one hand is contrasted to the plainness of plot and prose and action on the other. Yet the portmanteau structure, the imbrication of one with the other, is clearly more complicated than marking, say, a reversal of Shakespeare's royal plots and Cheapside subplots, or divorcing symbolism from realism. Because importantly, the songs are nonsense. The songs must escape semantics in order to imply an authentic poetic form, a form which yet depends on the explanatory structure of the plain prose for its existence. So we might say, as Tom did yesterday, that Yeats is expressing a certain contempt for any audience as he pushes toward form as extra-linguistic and self-satisfied, an expression through music or voice or stage design. Though we might also say the poetic form here depends on the reputation of another language, or the language of another. Thought about vertically, this other is God, of course, the secret woven into the act of weaving. But thought about laterally, it is the force of any language other than English, languages that Yeats isn't able to understand. It is because he can't understand them that the truth of poetry can be hidden in them, at a safe distance, always in relation, but at the same time fundamentally irretrievable. I'll leave it there, and thank you. I just realized I'm introducing Ragini. Okay. Okay. Ragini Mohita is assistant professor in literary and cultural studies at Flame University in India. Her really wonderful study, Modern Writers, Transnational Literatures, Rabindranath Tagore and W.B. Yeats, was published with Clemson in 2021. And in that work, Ragini clearly shows how a world literary system gets constructed through personal relations and thematic parallels across peripheral and semi-peripheral economic zones, namely India and Ireland. She also works more broadly in 20th century South Asian literature and global modernism, with a focus on poetry. She's currently writing work on Yeats, Tagore, and the Nobel, and on Tagore's use of fantasy. And today, her paper, I have it written down. Where I can
It's behind you.
Thank you.
Transnational spaces and transmutation in Yeats's writing.
Yeah, I think. Thank you for that. I think the transmutation in the title comes from a former title for the roundtable, but never mind, it stands. I'm interested in thinking through and examining Yeats's use of space within texts for today, and these are sort of ideas that I'm still working through, so I'd be sort of, again, very interested to have that conversation. I'd like to suggest that the coming together of physical place and cultural spaces within these texts, and particularly within the poems, both incorporate and extend the intrinsic the connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships, or the chronotype wherein spatial and temporal markers fuse together to form a whole. I think what Yeats's poetry does in my readings is to bring together different temporalities and spatialities, still fused together into a whole, but, oh.
Yeah, might as well. Of course I was going to.
Oh.
She's very kindly donated a copy of the book to our library. So I want to showcase that. Thank you so much for bringing this.
Very welcome. I've lost my place. Okay. Okay. All right. So yeah. So what Yeats's poetry is doing in the way that I'm reading it is bringing together different temporalities and spatialities. They're still fused together into a whole, but in a way that the textual space and the imaginary world that's sort of created within it are made truly transnational through that force of worlding, the precipitous ushering into a world or a meaningful whole that brings all beings into relation. And in understanding an approach like this, I'm informed, of course, by Jahan Ramzani's labeling of Yeats, along with Mina Loy, as bricoleur migrants, engaged in, intensely divided amid the various cultural affiliations mediated in their poetry. He also suggests that while using motifs and forms from places like Asia, Yeats hybridizes genres, meters, and orthographies in his works. So I'll start by sort of speaking about the way some of these poems seem to be bringing together and holding that transgression and literary referentiality. And then sort of depending on time, I'll look at the way Yeats occupies space on the transnational cultural stage of the Nobel. And I will draw on a work that Charlie's already heard me or read. Feng Che has suggested that, and I'm quoting here, the radical indeterminacy of literature's meaning also means that it exceeds the subject's powers of interpretation. Hence, literature does not merely map the spatialized world and give it value and meaning. Rather, its formal structures enact the opening of a world by the incalculable gift of time. He, in turn, is drawing on the works, of course, of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the sociologist of international law, who highlights that societies are constituted of various temporalities, and that many practices are disqualified, suppressed, or rendered unintelligible because they are ruled by temporalities that are not contained in the temporal canon of Western capitalist modernity. Only once these societies and practices become intelligible and known does the expansion of the present occur. In this case, by the revitalization of linear time and the valorization of other temporalities that may articulate or conflict with it. I'd like to suggest that Yeats's hybrid formal components carry out the further work of crafting the textual body as a spatio-temporal composite. I think this is evident, though not consistently evident, across his oeuvre, including, and I'm thinking of his early poem, Anasuya and Vijay, where he foregrounds a character from Kalidas's play Shakuntala, imbuing her with jealousy, which is the previous title for the poem. Anusaya, the name itself, means one free of jealousy. Meanwhile, her conflicted lover is Vijay, whose name means victory. The third character mentioned in this poem in absentia, and serving sort of as an impediment to the love that these characters share, is Amrita, or elixir or immortality. So I think the semantic weight of these names is transferred thematically, where the sort of push of jealousy and the pull of victory struggle with each other. I think similarly, just in regards to this poem, he sort of conceived of the two women as possessing one soul between them. And sort of one begins to question if Amrita, or the character or the elixir, is one that grants longevity to their love, or one which fuels the jealousy of her counterpart, sort of locking them in an endless tussle. And this is where I sort of look back to sort of Neil's comments yesterday on spirits as dramatizations, and I'm still working through what that might mean for the way I'm reading this poem. I think Yeats also sort of commented that the poem was initially an opening to a play that, and he was drawn to it when he saw a man at Ross's Point in Sligo carrying two salmon. And his mind seemingly drawn to the motif of the fish in Kalidas's play, right? In the play, the catching of this fish reveals the ring that Shakuntala's lost, which lifts the curse of forgetfulness from, of her husband. And it's this epiphanic moment of recognition and resolution. I think what's noteworthy in the poem is that it does speak to the formal motifs of the 4th century Common Era play, but also the temporal setting of that story, which originates even earlier in the Mahabharata. Unlike the source material, I think this poem sort of confronts us with frustrated irresolution. So it has that, it retains that dramatic and dialogic core, but it is also a textual snapshot of an extended dramatic space that never came to be. It's drawing a connection to Indian fiction from a culturally ubiquitous image of a fisherman on the Irish coast. And it superimposes sort of subplot and modern treatment on a spatiotemporally dislocated story. That said, I think the remnants of that dramatic core are where that spatiotemporality is best developed and destabilized. I think the opening stage directions, if I can call them that, establish a physical setting. It's a little Indian temple. It's surrounded by a garden, and the garden surrounded by a forest, sort of concentric circles in that sense. I think it indicates also the isolated setting that would have likely informed something of that unrealized plot, right? The dangers of the surrounding forest that Anasuya mentions, the panthers. She hopes they will end her lover if he loves another. There you have that sort of intended conflict. The opening scene of the poem, right, or the unrealized drama, the prayer is offered as she kneels inside the temple, safe from these dangers herself, buffered as she is by the most sculpted and tamed space of the garden. It's only when Vijay has referred to her as Amrita, and when questioned, uttered the seeming lie, it's my mother's name, does the action move outside the temple, right? From the inside of the temple to the steps and then further away. And it's in the outside that Anasuya returns to her prayer at the close of the poem. In doing so, I think she collapses that distinction between natural and architectural spaces, the forest, the garden, or the inner rooms of the temple, the mandap or the garbhagriha, where prayers are traditionally offered. I think this collapsing distinction melds together these physical and sort of cultural or religious spaces into the textual body of the poem, where her devotion, her love, and her jealousy can be enacted simultaneously. I think despite the spatial collapse, periodizing it as he does to the golden age in India displaces the dramatic scene to the compositional period of Kalidas's play, rather than the original setting for the plot itself. And I think that indicates something of its belatedness, and it sort of disallows a temporal crossing as effectively as it performs a spatial one. But I think that a more accomplished play with that sort of sense of spatio-temporal compression is found in his later and more mature poem, Lapis Lazuli. Joshua McCormack has carried out a Chinese reading of this poem in the Yeats Annual, number 19, I think. And she usefully sort of pinpoints the stone as being of a specific genre called the Jade Islands in China. And I'm quoting here from her passage there. Specifically, Yeats's stone may be taken to represent the Chinese Isles of the Blessed or Eternal or Eastern Paradise, traditionally believed to be the home of the 8 immortals. 2 are shown on Yeats's stone. These sages were not merely old, they were ancient, having achieved longevity, which merges indistinguishably into immortality. The sculpture, dating from sometime between 1739 to 1795, is imbued with the Chinese cultural imprint, carrying its provenance with it from China to Ireland and then into Yeats's poem. The poem itself places this artifact in relationship to the works of Telemachus and the tragic characters of Shakespeare's stages. All of these artifacts, or rather their images and their memory, serve as periodic respites from the onslaught of civilizational threats, whether it is, hordes come to put old civilizations to the sword, or William III's artillery, or the more modern military airplane and zeppelin. But in invoking them, I think, the speaker also acknowledges the physical and cultural threats through history. Even if not destroying these artifacts completely, they certainly change the ways in which we read them. I think the symbols of longevity and age and all of those crossings I'm not going to examine in depth here. What I am interested in is in the way in which the text of the poem performs that sort of unstable and cyclical historical dance. Moves from the images of destruction to the long-enduring plays of tragedy, to the onslaught of attacks, to the Chinese stone preserved, passed on, and now sitting on Yeats's desk, but never entirely free from the risk of destruction. Just going back to the sort of text of the poem, right? Sharing space within that same text, all of these different spatial distances are compressed, but so are the temporal passages, allowing them to exist not one after the other necessarily, but simultaneously. It's an extension of the argument which Fengxue makes regarding the idea of world as a temporal category, and that the unity and permanence of a world are thus premised on the persistence of time, but in a way that is distinct from the spatial categorization of the world based on zones of quantitatively measurable time, which I have a healthy respect for now. Yeats's act of worlding in this poem, I think, carries out both a preservative function of holding this compressed world together and giving it unity, but also the sort of epistemic violence embedded in the employment of the partial stone as symbol. Right? So the poem, for instance, makes no reference to the poem embedded on the stone, undeniably connected to the symbols that Yeats borrows, but untranslated and unacknowledged within this text. That said, we should acknowledge that it is a product of two artists, the unnamed poet and the author of the poem itself, and the unnamed sculptor. So in the body of the poem, there remains this unacknowledged fissure in the line of material acquisition and artistic lineage between those who inscribe the stone, Harry Clifton, the British poet and aristocrat who acquires it and bestows it and to whom the poem is dedicated, and Yeats himself, who interprets it and extends its frame of reference from stone to text. It's only in the first octave and the last 8 lines that we see anything of his poetic eye, compressing time and space to be able to see the sages at the end, seated in places they haven't reached, and allowing the 70-year-old speaker poet to use the text the way the Chinese sculptors use the stone, attributing to its material body a lapis-like endurance into a future moment of realization. I think what both these poems, from very sort of different stages of his career, do, at 2 different degrees, is to utilize sort of globally disparate physical spaces and times, and to marry their accompanying cultural weight in a way that the textual space itself becomes a transnational one on which the act of worlding is carried out. Do I have time? Can I stop there? Yeah, I think I'm gonna stop there. Thank you. Yes, I can do it. That was 20 minutes. That was 20 minutes.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So now we have to deal with the fact that we don't have a chair. See,
Well, yeah.
this is a cross-genre thing, yeah.
All right.
Do you want to? Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Maybe we'll just open the floor for questions, and then we can pick up threads as they emerge. But I'm conscious that maybe yesterday there wasn't as much time for questions as there could have been, and it'd be good to have more time for questions. So, so we start with questions, and then Ragini and myself can pick it up. Yeah. So, any questions?
Adrian, hi. You need the mic.
I have a short one, but this isn't really about the theme of the paper, it's something that's been puzzling me for a while, I've brought it up there, so if I may. Which is, yes, of course, as I said yesterday, it's a poet and writes poetry, but really doesn't write prose first, but almost, not necessarily all his poems, but very many of the poems that we had earlier for. He does what you said he does, and what the premise of the great podcast says he does, which is write prose, and then puts it into verse. As if this model of poetry writing is a kind of oral revelation. It's actually very different. It derives from a kind of construction of words, into ethically human rhyme in some way. And so I think your mention of that is really interesting. I wonder if you could account for that in a larger sense, and talk about the generic bending and stuff and shifting. Obviously, we're talking about a play which is doing the same, different things, but still doing genre bending. I sometimes wonder that kind of translation from prose to verse is perhaps the most interesting process, and we should concentrate on that. Maybe the revelation that things come in prose as opposed to poetry is more important than anything else. How do you read this processes, or you're not so much interested in the processes, but the outcomes and the juxtaposition?
I don't know if when you were talking, the word image came to mind, because this is one of the ways I think that Yeats explains that enigma, right? That, in other words, why doesn't the poetry simply exist within the parameters of the metrical line and the metrical verse? And image seems to be one of the ways he sort of describes or discursively understands the process. You're right to say that it changes, in terms of the themes of the conference, it changes the kind of temporality of our understanding of poetry, because the vision isn't in the poem. The vision's somewhere near the poem, and it's in the prose. It's in the prose, which is why I think he can incorporate so easily descriptive prose and discursive prose into his poetic endeavor, because he doesn't think that the form or the vision of the poem simply exists in the lines of the poem. So I'm not sure that that's answering your question, but I think it's something about maybe it's to talk to Ragini's paper. Maybe it's something as well about, she talked about the textual body, and there's something I think we all encounter when we're reading Yeats, is the richness of the textual body, and it's the fact that the poems don't simply exist, in a parameter within a set parameter. They seem to, as critics have always noticed, the poems and the volumes speak to each other, but also the way he incorporates different genres and shifts genre codes all of the time. And this might be something to do with the kind of the textual body, and so the act of reading the poem or the vision of the poem is actually it's a much more diffuse and vague process, actually, and it's something that you're constantly speculating beyond the poem, beyond the lines of the poem. But maybe that does refer to the textual body, but maybe not.
Well, I'm not going to answer your question either, Adrian. But but I'm also like, how far do you extend that sort of frame of reference of what is the textual body, right? You referred to Gitanjali in the introduction to Gitanjali, and I think I've been thinking about that in relation to the Nobel Prize, and it's really interesting in terms of, I suppose, the agenda of that introduction, because it does three things. You mentioned on a slide, part of Yeats's letter, was it the objective narrative and then the doctrine? And to me, that was really interesting in terms of the introduction to Gitanjali, which sits in three parts. And the first part sort of talks about what Yeats has heard about Tagore from, my Indians. Sure. The second sort of gives his sort of own reflections of, and I had a chat about this with Rob Dockett on the Yeats Conversations. Yeats sort of positioning himself as the first and very public reader of Tagore's English translations on railway trains and omnibuses and in restaurants, and having to put it away in case some strangers see how much it moved me. But the third passage, it sort of quotes extensively from Tagore's own translations. And it sort of seems to set up what he sees to be, maybe Tagore's doctrine, I don't know. But what that achieves in terms of the Nobel Prize is it allows the Nobel Committee report to draw on the language of the text itself. And I was thinking about this in terms of the Aaron Jaffe comment on, I have it here somewhere, hold on. With modernism, authorship instead resembles a kind of textual imprimatur. So you have that sense that the modern literary object bears the stylistic stamp of its producer prominently, at once as a distinctive mark and a sanctioning impression. It turns the author into a formal artifact, fusing it into the text as a reified signature of value. So again, not answering your question, just something interesting.
So just another thought, Adrian, on that, in response to Ragini. I was thinking that when I read Gitanjali, it's almost Yeats's prose instruction that is as important as reading the text. So in other words, what he does through that prose instruction is he relieves some of the burden from the reader, that sense that you have to find the form in the poems themselves rather than in something to do with the reputation of the poems in advance. And I think translation has exactly that kind of dynamic, right? Where the translated text is always referring to the reputation of the text in another language. And that gives it its authority. But it also relieves the reader of a burden. It can be, and I think that actually becomes part of the process of creating. And I think that's why prose always works with poetry in a translational context. But, yeah. Giza.
So thank you very much for your wonderful papers. I think they bring us, at least to me, some.
Okay. Oh, bye.
Thank you very much for your wonderful papers, because they bring me so many reflections upon all the themes you brought. And I just ask you to go back and just answer one of my questions, by the way, Mary. But if you don't mind going back to the idea of confusion, Yeats is establishing between lines, prose, and poems, and also gravity. I was really happy to read the connection you established with Boniface of the Santos idea of temporality. Because that makes me think not only a translation over time, the idea that whatever we translate, and I'm speaking from the perspective of the translator, we are considering the language of arrival, the culture of arrival, but also the perspective of Yeats being read among decades. And how transnational can that be? And I'm thinking of the trans there, transnational, trans culture. If you want to comment on that, I'll be really glad, because I'm still trying to make sense of the prose with the poetry as a translator.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe I'm still working through that. With what interested me about that, and sort of, the idea of thinking about it through this sense of, the epistemic violence of recognizing only part of that stone, to me was really interesting, because there is something to trace about the history of how, these objects sort of cross time and space. But also within, and I'm sure there's in that long journey to Yeats's table, there is some sort of, hidden epistemic violence within that object itself. But I'm also interested in, from Neil's paper yesterday, we were thinking about, the focus on, storehouses of memories and dramatizations of, the anti-self. And so, there's so much said and done about the preservation aspect, that the idea of forgetting to include this one image with one symbol in itself, the act of forgetting has a bit of a sort of violence encoded into it in some sense. And I'm still working through that. And so, yeah.
Can I just compliment? Because this is really by chance. I was going over Schmidt's views this afterward in Irene De Angelis' book, whose title I forgot. But the title of Hemistead, that was on a bar. That's the title of the. And if you don't mind my, excuse me, but it makes total sense to me, and it's really by chance. The last paragraph of the text, in the last paragraph, he says, He's commenting on Pound and on the other poets as he's commenting on haiku in her book, and it says, it can be further said that in the course of the 20th century, as empires and ideologies contended for supremacy and atrocities were committed on a scale unprecedented in human history, poets became desperately aware of the dangers of rhetoric and abstraction.
And just another supplement to the question, and specifically with reference to lapis lazuli. So in the poem, we know the untranslated inscription, which Ragini has mentioned. But the thing that's always struck me about that poem, as well as the untranslated inscription, there's also the temporal, as you said, the kind of temporal lag of the movement of the object, but also, of course, when we read the poem. But that's also something that Yeats reflects on through the accident or the contingency of the object. And it seems to me that one of the important aspects of translation is contingency, right? And that's temporal contingency, right? So that the time lag is built in to translation. And again, that's one of the reasons it can be, so affecting, because exactly of the contingency, rather than the idea that we have to translate it in some, exact or symbolic way, which is true. I think Adam has a question, and then did you have a question, Bruce? You can.
You sure?
Yeah. I'm just wondering whether, it's a bit puzzling to me, whether the image, which has this idea that maybe it's using prose to flatten and present it so it comes out strongly, like great passing through the words. Whether the image has to be, it is a chronotype or chronotopic object. But there is a problem though if it can only be communicated in English in the end, because of the problem of, you either take English as being a kind of lingua franca, or as an imperial medium, right? And then both of those are problematic, aren't they? So it's whether English is the proper space in which the chronotopic object can be nestled.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I sort of struggle with that as well. I believe the McCormack essay that I was reading, I read it on the flight actually, and she makes a mention in the footnote that apparently Dulac offered to have it translated and Yeats never followed up on that. And so that was really interesting to me. And I suppose my way of sidestepping your question is by saying that, because he takes care with acknowledging the sort of the accident of it in that sense, right? And there is very much that sort of push and pull between a sort of violence, but also a sort of care within that, so just maybe the specter of it remains, or the spirit of it remains, but is unacknowledged, and maybe necessarily so, because again, I'd be interested in hearing sort of people's opinions on what they think of the image as being, say, the front of the sculpture, and how we identify that, because the sort of the inscriptions on Chinese mountains, for example, I mean, the scale is very, very different, but you think of them as the front of the mountain. So again, I'm sidestepping your question, Adam, sorry.
I think Bruce had it. Need the microphone, Bruce?
So I'm actually rather removing the point which I was struggling earlier on, and that's on the three language translation of what besides our own, which is essential trope of Anglo-Irish literature. Most commonly cited as the source of word English stage language and which we don't sing, which is you're suggesting that there was a sort of epileptic translation process going on between Yeats's prose structures, his prose versions, which in themselves are quite exceptional. I think we don't find John Keats, for example, writing the prose version and go to Nightingale before he writes the poem. And then yet, mysteriously, Yeats, portrait Pale Cur Moon, and Brilliant Moon, makes a negative curious, he said, to emphasize the image when it comes. But then you get a line which once read never quits your mind, like slouches and to be born. You ask yourself, where did the word slouch come in? That certainly doesn't come from the original. The structure is something different, and there's a metamorphosis going on. He wants to draw a line, but that line is actually a moment of chemical fusion. It's what separates gold from diamond, or perhaps. So what I would simply want to say in conclusion is that the idea of its capacity to engage in different languages, as we were different dialects of English, but essentially to focus upon what the apprehension is poetic language. And can I say just finally that it's extraordinary how much of its talk about poetry is actually antagonistic in the sense that it is followed with an ungiven, which is rather a nasty distance, in fact. And yet he labored, downright insulting, he told me it was too difficult, and then he labored to explain in the sense that they were speaking male dads and so forth. That's really what I have to offer. I'm just trying to describe about this celebration going back.
I think Matt had a question. Thank you, Bruce. As you were talking there, I was thinking I was going to say something about Parnell's funeral, if we don't have time. But in that, he in all the versions of that poem, including the one where there's the essay that intermits, he has this image of the rats. The rats rhyming, and this is from Shakespeare, I think, but a reference to Shankin, the poet who, when the rats ate his dinner, he could rhyme, and then the rats would die. He could kill them with rhyme. But again, it's a reference. I think it's a reference to a rhyme, but it's a rhyme in Irish that isn't in the poem. I mean, the poem also rhymes, but it rhymes in English. So again, for me, another example of kind of something that is that exceptional to Yeats. I don't know. I mean, but it certainly conforms to what I'm thinking about the function of translation in Yeats's practice, and also our non-translation. It might even be, to go back to lapis lazuli, to non-translation, to the fact of not translating it, but nonetheless the reputation of the other language has to be there. And in terms of Yeats's exceptionalism, I don't know, but I'd like to hear whether other poets use the word style or the term style as much as Yeats, because style seems to me a word that he focuses on an awful lot. And of course, style isn't quite form, and I'm very interested in the term style, and I wonder, are there other poets who use that term as much as Yeats does? Pound, maybe, yeah. Tom and Matt, I don't know if Matt had a question. Sorry.
My question is, I suppose, just about, you're obviously kind of between the two of you covering a big expanse of the career, going to very back early and then through to the 30s. And, I think when we think of, I suppose, this kind of very radical mode of translation, with Yeats, we do think of the 1910s, we think of Tagore, we think of Pound. But I suppose I was wondering, Barry, you put up that slide, which is just how many texts came out of this, translation project, the Swami in the 30s, but then also, you're going right back. So I suppose I was just wondering, how that kind of, just the chronology of that, does this change? Does this kind of, it seems to be so much more, the King of the Cocktail feels so much more kind of extreme. versus, and whereas, and obviously with Hyde, there's at least the promise of a kind of national body of culture that might be rejuvenated through this kind of translation. So yes, so just wondering about the temporalities.
No, I'm going to have to think about that. Hold on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree that, you know, my focus really at the minute is on the 1930s. I'm interested in 1930s. I'm interested in the function of nonsense. That the idea, I mean, of course, in the sort of translatories that you get it in Scott, you get it in romantic poetics as well. That Yeats kind of inherits in the late 19th century has, yes, as you say, a kind of national horizon of meaning, right? Or it seems to have a national horizon of meaning. One of the things, I suppose, that makes Yeats a transnational poet is the way that he mobilizes the nonsense, you know, the nonsense of it, the Lake Olivet is free, in a simple way, right? The nonsense of of that line, that title. You know, it's a pleonastic title. It's you know, and that I think so. Yeah, I suppose I'm just seeing that as a kind of germ for something that becomes maybe more conscious or certainly more naturalized in his practice when he's thinking differently in the 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, I think where he sort of turns his textual spaces transnational most effectively, to my mind, right, is when he sort of performs that act of bricolage, but essentially where sort of the ground zero for the text still remains in his close proximity. So the way that he uses, say, lapis lazuli here, but it's still sitting on his desk. What I love about his other use is the two poems in which he uses Sato's sword. Right? It's still sort of, you know, meditation sometimes sort of what my table. It's still very, very localized, but it's a bringing in of that. And I think there is a play with temporality, not necessarily a terrible respect for it in that sense. Because again, even going back to his prose in the 1910s that we talk about, I find it very interesting, like we were discussing, he likens Tagore to, you know, a bunch of, you know, Renaissance writers and saints and Chaucer's forerunners, but he's also talking about, you know, him as a stand-in for sort of the Indian civilization itself. And what was it? If the civilization of Bengal remain unbroken. So to his mind, that is a sort of, you know, an ancient in that sense, sort of ancient enough to be made immortal kind of sense of time, because Bengal, in its political reality, was that it had been fragmented in 1905, right? There's a lot of the sort of the geopolitical stuff that he's not recognizing in it, because he's throwing back even further. So I think there's the treatment of that sort of temporality is to play with it. But have I answered that?
Okay, I think that's it. We're out of time.
We're out of time. All right, thank you.
But I was just so happy. Thank you so much.
I was so excited to bring it to you. I cannot tell you.
And I'm telling you, I was